important messages there from him. Now, General Kellogg does know about the Russians and how they negotiate. He's been around that block many, many times. And, I think if General Breedlove was, listening to this as well, and former Minister Klimkin, Ambassador Klimkin, I'm sure they'll have some comments, particularly from the military perspective and from the on the ground in Ukraine. But I wouldn't then, attribute the views of General Kellogg, his analysis, to everybody else on the team around President Trump, because I don't think everybody else there, including, with all due respect to Special Envoy Witkoff, have got that same experience. And I can see Angela Stent here in the audience, and Angela's often commented in the same way that Alina did about, the danger of giving carrots to the Russians. Depending on the texture of the carrots, they'll either eat them or they'll take them and hit you over the head with them. And I think that that's kind of, one of the risks that we're seeing at the moment, because what I've seen coming back in some of the pronouncements, again, not from General Kellogg, but from some of the statements from a Special Envoy Witkoff and others, is that they've taken completely on board both the Russian talking points and the Russian positions. I mean, as was the question, Margaret Brennan tried to get to this, or the people did from the audience in the questions, asking about what was the term sheet, from the Russians. I think we can see very clearly, first of all, bilateral irritants that was mentioned in one of the announcements is Russian code for absolutely every single thing that they're angry with the United States about. So it's not bilateral irritants from the United States point of view, because we mostly don't pay attention to some of these issues, but it's all of the kind of the Russian positions. When General Kellogg was talking about the Ukrainian term sheet, I think the Ukrainians have been pretty consistent. Everything is a loss to Ukraine. Let's be clear about this. Every single thing that Ukraine is having to negotiate with is a loss. Every single thing. Every single thing is a concession, because they're the country that was invaded. And the Russians have made it very clear, which was also laid out in some of the discussion, that they want territory that they currently do not control. So is the concession from the Russians going to be that they'll only take the parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, or Donetsk, Luhansk that they currently don't control, and then they won't go further? That would be, not much of a concession from the Ukrainian point of view. Every single thing that Ukrainians are being asked to do is to concede. Now, I also understand from listening to General Kellogg very carefully, and look, again, I just want to say we should all be very grateful that he's laid all of this out. It was very clear that the Ukrainians obviously missed a beat because something was completely lost in translation. And again, I think Zelenskyy made a fatal error by not having everything translated. And my advice from, basically being in the administration or any administration, all the people here who've worked in foreign service would be, do not negotiate, have a discussion, anything that is not your native language, no matter how you speak it. I say the same to Macron. If I was the Brits, I would have somebody translate from British to American all the time as well, because sometimes things are lost as well, just to be very clear. And I know that, Prime Minister Stan was already here and President Trump loved his accent, but have, your American interpreter, because things are lost all the time. And I think that what Zelenskyy didn't understand, that he was being offered a treaty of sorts. That only actually occurred to me as I was listening to General Kellogg, because President Trump doesn't abide by any of the contracts or treaty that was signed by any previous government. And when Zelenskyy said to President Trump, and I watched actually that press conference 5 times to try to kind of figure out where things went wrong. There were multiple points, but one of them was when President Zelenskyy pointed to your president, he kept saying to President Trump, who already signed agreements, either Obama or Biden, and President Trump cast those aside. What President Trump was actually telling Zelenskyy is, you're signing something with me. This will be the only thing that you're signing, a basic exchange of letters. It was kind of a treaty of sorts. President Trump doesn't care about the Budapest Memorandum from 1994. He wasn't there. He doesn't care about any of the other commitments or recognitions of Ukraine that have been made, or UN resolutions, because they weren't made by him. Up until this point, there's been no agreement between Ukraine and President Trump. And that's what we were being told. And I had a bit of a eureka moment sitting at the back when I kind of realized that that was the case. And I don't think that President Zelenskyy understood that. Because again, his English is not that good. I mean, even, kind of for those of the English speakers, we're not always understanding the import because we don't fully understand as General Kellogg does. Because remember, General Kellogg has been with President Trump from the very beginning, from his first campaign. He understands him better than anyone. He's still there with him. Other people don't understand that in exactly the same way. And you have to have different levels of interpretation. What does President Trump himself mean? And what does the actual translation of the words mean? It's the context and the content. And that's why I would kind of go back to your initial question, is with all due respect to Special Envoy Witkoff, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and everybody else who went there without any interpretation or context. They have no clue what the Russians are actually talking to them about. Their interpretation is coming from directly speaking to Ushakov, Lavrov, and Kirill Dmitriev, who all speak excellent English and who have been around this bloc forever and who completely understand who they are, how they interact in their system, how the other system interacts. Remember, Kirill Dmitriev was at Harvard. He's worked for a whole host of Goldman Sachs, all kinds of other, Western entities. He knows exactly who he is, who he's talking on behalf of, how far he can go, and his English is impeccable. And so I think, unfortunately, and this is what the Russians are telling us. I mean, if you look, as Alina is doing, at the Russian interpretation of all of this, they're being quite scathing. They're saying this, we haven't even got the junior varsity on the team here. We've got the, the intramural, or basically the pickup game. And they're thinking right now that they can manipulate this. Now, General Kellogg is saying we'll see when we get there. But, at this point, the United States is going out of the door with the Russians on their side of the table, not just reaching that point. And General Kellogg himself understands this, but I'm not so sure that the other people around him do.
That's a very helpful analysis, Fiona, of both the speech of General Kellogg, but also the past meetings. Let me turn now to Pavlo Klimkin. Thanks so much for joining us for this discussion. There has been some hope from a Ukrainian perspective that there could be a reset in US-Ukraine relations after this meeting in the White House. Now it seems, and we've heard this again from General Kellogg today morning, that it is unclear how any reset would look like, that some of the negotiation levels that the administration sees it has towards Ukraine will be kept in their hands for a longer period of time to try to use them not only for the economic partnership agreement or the minerals deals, but potentially also for other concessions that they want to see from the Ukrainian side. What is Ukraine's strategy to react to that? And I know it's tough to develop a strategy under such a high pressure, but what would you recommend?
Good afternoon from Kiev. We have to develop our strategy and we have to get an answer. But if you talk to Ukrainians, I mean, not only in Kiev, and I've been browsing a lot around the country, it's a sort of emotional shock for many people, because firstly, many welcome the idea of peace through strength. But now people see a lot of strength towards Ukraine and basically no strength towards the Russians. So someone should have, exchanged the baskets with carrots and something else. It's basically the sense if you are not in Kiev, if you just talk to people. The second point, which worries me even more, it's a kind of focus on eventual NATO extension as a fundamental origin of that. And Putin has been talking about the origins. And it's a fundamentally flawed understanding why the war is like that and why the war had started. The reason for that is that anybody in Russia and anybody in the Russian leadership fundamentally reject the mere fact that Ukraine is there. Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian statehood, basically everything. And in 2014, when the invasion into the Crimea started, we were constitutionally a sort of non-bloc country. It's really important to understand, because the fundamental reason for that is that Russia sees us as a kind of ill-fated wrong Russia and us as wrong Russians. So if you kind of ask an AI app what to do if you need to eliminate the sort of, so you get your answer. So if you ask a wrong question and if you mention a set of wrong origins, you are fundamentally nowhere. And I'm afraid it's partly what's happening now. Third point, we clearly understand that we need our European allies on our side. We need a strategy, a sort of common strategy with them, because there is no way how European security or European security architecture, but also by definition European security can be there without Ukraine. Unfortunately, this point is coming down into the minds of many European politicians and also militaries, but not really into the European societies. There is a sort of clear asymmetry here. But what the new US administration has already achieved is actually the Chinese talking directly to the Europeans and saying, yeah, of course you should be at the table. Of course Europe is important. So it's the whole geopolitics now kind of changing. In our way, we are of course ready to show again that we need our allies. We are ready to enter into difficult negotiations, but not on our expense and not over our head. What fundamentally would not work? Actually, both US and Russia got us wrong in 2022. In the sense of our resilience, in the sense of our emotions, and in the sense of our understanding what is at stake in this war. And we understand that it's about our existence as Ukrainians. So we are ready to engage in real conversation. Also at the backdrop of this emotional spikes. But now if you talk to Ukrainians, just Ukrainians, not somebody from political classes, many people started saying, look, maybe it's about Europe and us about part of Europe. But it's a very dangerous development because it would lead to a total fragmentation of the West and probably the mere question what actually the West is about now. And our strategy in the coming weeks is, of course, to get back with our engagement, to repair what we can repair, and to build decent conversation, and we are ready for that, but also to engage in the way possible with the Europeans. And we have European summit now happening in Brussels, a number of ideas there. And it's about how to include Europe as a fundamental intrinsic part of the European reality, is how I see it now.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And you mentioned two things which are so important. I think the European strategy, but also the China element in that. And I hope we can come back to that in the Q&A and in the comments question. But General Breedlove, if I could turn to you on the question of Europe. Europeans have been asked and invited by the Trump administration to take over the security guarantees question in Ukraine, right? So it seems that there is an idea of a division of labor, that the United States negotiates the ceasefire and the Europeans secure the ceasefire. Now, Europeans have come to town asking for a backstop for that mission, although it's unclear what exactly that backstop will look like. General Kellogg has also not specified it this morning. Under these conditions, would you recommend Europeans to go for the security guarantee, to go for a European mission in Ukraine? And how could this look like?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be on stage with these two and with Pavlo as well. And before I go to your question, I just want to pass that. Of course, I agree with what Pavlo has said, but I want to violently agree with a few points Alina and Fiona made about how we're being perceived in the world at dealing with the two sides of this issue. On one side, we've got a criminal aggressor. And in the world's eye, we're treating that criminal aggressor with kid gloves. On the other side, we have a nation that's been invaded, clearly the victim, and we seem to be dealing with them with a hammer. And so it's I don't want to resurface all the conversation, but it's hard for some of us who travel a lot in Europe to be able to sit down with our allies and discuss why this might be happening. And I want to highlight two things. Right out of the gate, we have given Russia huge policy wins. For decades and decades, Mr. Putin has wanted to deal with America about Europe without Europe. And we've always kept Europe in the middle of the conversation, and we fought hard not to allow Mr. Putin to establish this idea that he is above Europe and he should be able to do European matters with the American president one-on-one, whoever the American president is. And we seem to now have caved on that, and that we are now doing business with Mr. Putin on Europe without Europe. And in a similar fashion, since the winter of 2013 and 14, when I was the SACEUR and Russia first invaded Crimea and then invaded the Donbass, we have all said that we will not deal about Ukraine without Ukraine. And now we are caving on that as well. So before the negotiations even start, we have given huge policy concessions to Russia. And I don't think we're walking in the door with a strong hand when that's the way we begin. So I'll get off of that and now get to the question you asked me. I just wanted to agree with what both Alina and Fiona had said in my own words. So first of all, I applaud what Europe is doing. Okay, so forever there has been some, and legitimate, I would add, complaints about how Europe has approached Article 3. Not Article 5, but Article 3. Article 3, in a Georgia boy's words, are that defense begins at home. In other words, these nations need to invest in themselves. Some people use the word wrong. They're not paying. They don't pay, they invest. And so these people are now really climbing on the stump and investing in their own militaries and their capabilities. So you can't even have a conversation about Article 5 if you haven't got Article 3 right. And I think we're on our way to getting Article 3 right. Article 4 is also not being taken care of right now because Article 4 says that the United States, as one of the allies, should be sitting at the table consulting with European allies about these matters. When Article 4 is declared, the allies of NATO come together and discuss. We don't go off and have single combinations with the criminal aggressor about matters Europe. And so if we have Article 3 straight, if we get Article 4 straight, then it's much easier to talk about what we need to do now, which is, yes, maybe it's a good idea that the Europeans are the bulk of the land contribution to what might happen to secure Ukraine's future. But America has to be a part of that as well. And I think we've sort of cleared the air, but early in these conversations, one of our senior most ministers sort of made an intimation that we would not honor our Article 5 if something broke out. We're telling the Europeans to go there, take care of this problem, and we won't be with you if a dust-up occurs with Russia. I think we've got to clean that up. We need to make a public, demonstrative, clear commitment to Article 5 as an ally in the NATO alliance.
Wonderful. Thank you, General. That has been an excellent first one. Alina, do you want to come in with two things, and then we will open up for questions and comments from the audience?
No, just a very quick comment to what General Breedlove just laid out on the backstop conversation. I think one of the epiphanies I've had recently in conversations with other administration officials is that just like the president sees the world very differently than perhaps many of us are in this room or the Ukrainians, and we need translation, there's another element to this, which is that it's really hit me that he and probably others around him do not see Ukraine and NATO as connected issues. Meaning there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, that's one issue, and that's what we're trying to get to from the perspective of the president. And then there's the NATO question, which is completely separate. But of course, in Europeans' minds, these are deeply intertwined, interlinked issues because of all the reasons that General Breedlove just laid out. We're gonna have a European-led coalition, may not be a full NATO coalition, 5, 6 countries, you know, whatever that looks like. Will the US be there to protect and defend those forces in Ukraine, even if it's not a NATO force? And so in the president's mind, tying NATO Article 5, collective defense to the ceasefire in Ukraine is like completely incomprehensible. So he sees this as completely separate issues and Europeans do not. So when your question, I think that you had posed, Leanna, Europeans are coming asking for a backstop, but like, and it's incomprehensible to the president as to why they're talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I want to do a two finger to the two finger
okay.
because it's the global dimension of this as well. And I was actually, you know, heartened to at least hear General Kellogg for the first time, frankly, of an administration, you know, official really laying out the global dimensions of this, of China, North Korea, and also Japan being in Japan. I'm going to mention Japan because this is why I'm raising this, and Iran being involved here, because this is important for our other allies, for Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and many other countries out there watching all of this very closely. But I was not heartened, you know, by the same issues that Melina is, you know, laying out here. When General Kellogg said that for President Trump, these have always been, you know, before separate, that everybody was trying to keep North Korea, China, and he said, you know, Iran and Russia all separately. Well, they're not separate. They've become, you know, pretty fused together here. And that counts for Europe as well. That you said it, you know, China's an important issue. Well, Europe and Europeans have their own relationship with China. China was the biggest single country investor in Ukraine before the war, and has then sided you know, very consistently with Russia in this conflict. North Korean troops are in Europe. They're not just in the Kursk region of Russia. They're fighting in Europe for the first time. I think General Kellogg was absolutely 100% right, that are they preparing for something on the Korean Peninsula? South Korea and Japan have to worry about all of that. So these have to be dimensions as well. And South Korea and Japan are watching this. And as I said, Taiwan and others very closely. And then the Middle East. It was fascinating as well that General Kellogg said, you know, we all started getting involved in this with Saudi Arabia because of MBS. Well, yes, because they're all watching Iran. And they're watching, you know, how this has now become part of the Middle East conflict as well. The fact that meetings are taking part in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey and elsewhere just shows how things are really shifting here. So this isn't just about Ukraine. You can't just separate it off and then, you know, basically push Ukraine out the door and figure out that you can then, you know, deal with this on, you know, the same kind of playing field as before. Yeah,
the global impacts there. General Breedlove, I'm going to pretend that I haven't seen your two fingers because I really, which is unfair because you're on screen and on Zoom there, and I know it's unfair. But I will come back to you with once we have a first round of questions, and you can tie in what you wanted to say, because I really want to give our audience the opportunity to ask questions here. We have an audience here in Washington and on Zoom, and I will bring you in. Please identify yourself. And also keep your question short. And if you can say to whom this question is directed, all the better. So I take a first question from the room. Over here.
I'm Alexandra Starr with International Crisis Group. This is a question for Fiona. Why is Trump doing this? You've worked with him for a long time. Well, you've had experience with him in the first administration. His comments during that press conference, you know, talking about everything that he and Vladimir Putin had been through together, seems to speak to a psychological dimension to this that I'd be very grateful to get your comments on.
Fiona.
Well, look, I think General Kellogg also made some of the things, you know, very clear. President Trump is very interested in strength and not in weakness. And, you know, if you go back again to that press conference, I think lots of things were very clear. It's about respect. Remember at one point when President Zelenskyy was asking him about, well, does nothing matter about what Obama or Biden, your presidents, you know, meaning United States presidents, have committed to in the past. You know, President Trump at that point lost his temper, basically saying, don't compare me with, you know, Presidents Obama and Biden. They were weak people. Nobody respected them. Everybody respects me. So it gets back to, you mentioned Helsinki, which is kind of a painful episode, I think for myself personally and for many others, where President Trump has always made it very clear that the people who he sees as his peers are the strongmen in the world, and that would be Putin. It's not his staff. It's certainly, you know, not his intelligence advisors or anything like that. It's people like Vladimir Putin. He respects strength. Now, I think, you know, General Breedlove has probably been wanting to come in, and I remember actually being on a panel with him sometime before when he said, you know, a lot of the strength of Russia is illusory. You know, he commented on the, and you'll remember this, General Breedlove, on the forces that the Russians had amassed on the border, 180,000, 200,000, you know, roughly, and pointed out that this was, you know, about the capacity of the Tennessee Volunteers Stadium, for example. I think that was one of the ones that used, and I've been in that stadium, and that, you know, when those people, you know, basically go out and kind of dissipate across a large area, it's almost as if there'd been nobody there at all. The strength of Russia at this point is more than you know, it is in actuality. We haven't mentioned 870,000 Russian casualties, people killed in action and severely wounded. And I noticed actually General Kellogg made no mention of the Russian casualties. He mentioned the Russian, but it was really Soviet casualties in World War II, and Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, Belarusians, you know, you name it, Central Asians, Kazakhs, you know, and others fought in World War II as Soviet citizens. It wasn't all Russian casualties. This is a staggering scale of casualties on the part of Russia, because that's what Putin is prepared to pay, the price he's prepared to pay. So I think in some respects, Putin is strong in the sense that he's willing to preside over a slaughter, which is something that clearly President Trump and General Kellogg and others are not, to their credit. But it's basically a misreading on the part of, I think, you know, President Trump about who Putin is. And the way that Putin thinks about things. President Trump thinks that President Putin respects him. He wants him to respect him. He talks about this all the time. And I think, you know, most of us would be sadly, you know, kind of remiss if we didn't realize that President Putin is playing that absolutely to the hilt.
Oh, yeah.
And that's very unfortunate. And of course, when President Zelenskyy tried to point that out, that was another reason that he got kind of bludgeoned in the White House. Anybody who points out, you know, kind of an unpleasant message gets absolutely and utterly bludgeoned. And at some point, that message will become clear when President Putin tries to manipulate something. But then, you know, I suspect that President Trump will blame other people and not blame President Putin.
Thank you, Fiona. I'll give General Breedlove the opportunity to also quickly come in on that question.
So I want to get to that two-finger I raised before as well.
that you can tie into.
You know, many of us remember when we were young, our parents said, people don't care what you say, they care what you do. I'm often asked, what is our policy towards North Korea? Or what is our policy China, Taiwan? Or what is our policy about Iran? And I point out to them that these things are well stated. You can do a simple Google search and you will see that policy. But then I make them angry because I say none of that really matters, because people don't care what you say, they care what you do. Our North Korea policy, our Iran policy, our Russia, China, Taiwan, all the policies in the world are now really being written every day in Ukraine. The world is watching what we do towards our commitments to Europe and Ukraine about European security. So you can have all those other things written you want, but people are watching what we do. It's an interesting point that Fiona brings up about casualties and costs. I believe right now that Russia needs a ceasefire worse than anybody. They need it worse than anybody. They're backing up in the last 2 days in the Donbass. and they're throwing bodies at Kursk in an amazing way. They have now asked North Korea twice to send soldiers to help them recapture sovereign Soviet, or excuse me, Freudian slip, sovereign Russian land. Okay? So twice now they are asking North Korea to help them retake Russian land. That should tell you a lot about the state of the Russian army. They desperately need a ceasefire, and they want us to guarantee that ceasefire via these agreements so that they can rebuild. It's going to take them 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to get really ready again because their army has been decimated so badly. But they'll, unless they run into something hard, unless the bayonet runs into something hard, they will be back.
Thank you, General. I think we now have a question. We take another one from the room. So the lady over here.
Thank you. Christina Siegel-Knowles, former National Security Council. I was interested in taking the conversation back to the China dimension. I think we heard from General Breedlove that he sees connections here, but then when you turn to his comments on how are they putting pressure on Russia, he talked about, for example, sanctioning the shadow fleet. China has clearly underwritten the Russian war effort, both through supply of materials and also because it is the purchaser and increasingly the major purchaser of Russian oil, keeping the economy afloat. I wondered, how should we think about, is it possible to bring about a lasting peace deal without a Chinese dimension? Is it possible to put maximum pressure on Russia without having China at the table or in the conversation? And how should we think about the strategy in that context?
Thank you so much. I would like to give this question to Pavlo Klimkin, because I think it would be particularly interesting to have an answer from the Ukrainian perspective there, how you see and Ukraine sees the China dimension, because I think there has been partly an ambiguous policy towards China from the Ukraine's perspective throughout this war.
China was and is helpful to Russia in supplying basically everything beyond lethal stuff. But I also believe the Chinese are kind of not worried on Russia being eventually off hook, because they believe the level of dependence, and not just trade dependence, because Russia has 31% of export to China, 39% of export and 31% of import. But in the sense of technology, it's basically real dependency now. But even if you go to a normal Russian bank branch in a kind of Russian town in the middle of nowhere, you can get now a deposit in Chinese currency. It's something fundamentally different. But the Chinese will be playing and are playing extremely smart towards Europe. Now kind of going towards Europe and saying, look, guys, US is not reliable anymore. And with us, you have reliability, you have trade reliability, you have security, you have all kind of dimensions around Eurasia. Why not just start elevating our partnership? And the Chinese are also smart, understanding their possibilities in being engaged for the first time ever in their history in talking about European security, about Ukraine or about everything else, and not just talking with all kind of their initiatives, but probably being present. Not at the level of troops or so, but probably monitors. And the Chinese are present at higher scale at the Western Balkans. Lukashenko is also under their umbrella. And probably they are instrumental in the sense of delivering on his independence. So Ukraine would be extremely important for them in the sense of understanding their future presence. So if they are ready to elevate their engagement with Europe, and now they feel the moment, if they are able to elevate their presence in the Central and Eastern Europe, they are in a fundamentally different position in Eurasia. So I believe the Chinese will try to use this chance. The Chinese understand that if we go towards the West, it's about the West to define what is possible and not possible in the sense of our security. So for them to be present in the European security is something fundamentally they would be willing to go for. So it's the real moment for the Chinese, and I believe they will use this opportunity at the full speed. And last point, who could have imagined us and North Koreans fighting in the Russian Kursk region 3 years ago? It was something totally mind-blowing. The Chinese clearly understand that security is now can be seen in fundamentally geographical terms. They see it globally, and for them it's exactly the moment. But it's also about the US credibility. We have now 4 areas where Russia would push to restrain our sovereignty. It's about territory, it's about our potential to defend ourselves, it's about our military forces and technologies, it's about our future choice, NATO and EU, but also how the future Ukraine should look like in the sense of what kind of Ukraine. So in this sense, it's also a moment where the Chinese would see the results of these negotiations as a fundamental weakness or strength in the sense of directions. And the Chinese will use it fully. I mean, believe me, they are good in analysis and they are good in feeling that the moment is there. There is a fundamental concept of the Chinese Xi energy. It's a kind of, if you feel this moment or not, and I believe they do.
Thank you. And let's just add to that, that in some European capitals, there certainly is a temptation to use China as a hedge against the potential negative consequences, tariffs towards Europe by the Trump administration. Let's take one more question from the virtual wheel from Zoom.
We'll take our next question from Ambassador Peter Gabriel.
Thank you. I want to, this has been terrific, and Fiona, I especially appreciate your comments about negotiating in language, having done that in the Balkans in the 1990s. It's a huge question. But I'll preface this by saying we're seeing very radical things from the Trump administration domestically, Elon Musk, Doge, and so on. And therefore, I wonder, General Breedlove, whether what we are seeing are actually concessions or a reorientation of US foreign policy to an alliance of the strong and where Trump can get what he wants, namely to be part of the nexus of Russia, North Korea. You remember all the talk about the love letter from Kim Jong-un, and Iran, noting that at the time he applied maximum pressure on Iran, he said he regretted doing it, or he had reservations about doing it, and the Russians recently have been saying they'd like to patch things up between the US and Iran. At the same time, as he's talking about, he's repeatedly critical of NATO, talked about pulling out of it, and possibly getting into a conflict with Europe if he in fact goes ahead and uses military force to seize Greenland. And perhaps he would even see letting Russia have what it wants in Ukraine as a quid pro quo for letting him take Greenland. I know it's radical, but we live in radical times.
Yeah, so let me boil down the question to, is this tactics and negotiations, or is there a strategy behind it, a strategic realignment or reorientation, General Breedlove?
So I've told a lot of people in Europe that if anybody comes to you and tells you they know what President Trump is thinking, you should put down your pencil and turn off your recording device. And I'll be the first to say, I cannot tell you what President Trump is thinking here, but observing what's happening, you used the term, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for the question, reorientation. I have a much more simplistic view of this. I haven't read his whole book, but a friend of mine gave me a copy so that I could read chapter 6 about how he does negotiations. And when he, things I remember from that chapter is set an abnormally or unusually high bar so that when you can back away from it, you're seen as a good guy in the negotiations. So I look at a lot of these things, Mr. Ambassador, that you're talking about are grenades that have been thrown out on the table, and after they explode, we all see how it sorts out afterwards. So I take everything that is said, these very explosive kind of things that they have been said, as just that explosive grenade, and let's get to the more serious conversation after they clear. This morning I was on another show, I'm sorry, and I got hit with the question that all of a sudden there was a statement that we might want to remove the SACEUR from being an American officer. And I said, you know, having been the SACEUR, I have some ideas about that. But I told them, I said, listen, we need to let the dust settle. This could be Russian disinformation. When you see something that out of orbit, you should really just take the time to let the dust settle.
Great, thank you.
Could I just say one quick thing about this? Because I do actually agree with General Breedlove that, you know, there's a lot of grenade throwing here, cluster bombs actually, more than just grenades. But we can think of some other additions to the end of cluster as well, which was a result of all of this. But I think the problem is that other people do take it as a reorientation.
Yes.
And what we're seeing now is our allies and our not so allies, adversaries and others, adjusting to this, just like the conversation about China. And other people have agency here. It's not just one guy and one guy's thoughts. First of all, there are 330 million Americans, but there are 550 million Europeans, and there are 8 billion people on the planet who are all making, you know, if they've got some information here, their own decisions and their own analyses about what is happening in here, how it affects them. So once you've blown things up, you can't necessarily, you know, put them back together again, and you can't backtrack often, you know, from some of the positions that you've put out there, because I mean, the Russians are already acting accordingly, and lots of other people are as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Fiona. We take one more question from the room and one more question from online. Okay.
Thank you, Benjamin Schmidt, University of Pennsylvania. I just want to make a couple of points on the sanctions discussion that we heard earlier from General Kellogg. He's mentioning that we put a maximum pressure campaign through designation of hulls of Russian Shadow Fleet vessels, yet as he said himself, the enforcement has been lacking. I think that's ongoing. But at the same time, we're also seeing what I think is, to the rest of your points on a potential strategic realignment with the Russian Federation, when we see that there's been notions that Trump has actually sent his envoy Richard Grenell to Switzerland a number of times to try to negotiate a return of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany, which is ludicrous, and there cannot be a return to business as usual in energy, because again, these we're talking a lot of, obviously this is a Ukraine forum, but the Russian Federation is a malign actor well beyond Ukraine. There is active and ongoing sabotage operations, subsea cable cuts, subsea pipeline incidents, assassinations, all of these sort of things going on across the West that do, as President Zelenskyy say, come back and impact us here in the United States as well. So what can we do to kind of head off this strategic realignment? I don't think there's any chance that we will actually have a quote unquote reverse Nixon and peel Russia to our side against China. I think they'll just pocket the win and move on. But any thoughts on this and how we can actually reorient ourselves to push back on this?
Thank you so much. This has been reported about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline by the German Bild side, who now so far has denied it. But I would like to give the question on sanctions to you, Aline, because there's, and add one more, if I may, to your plate. First of all, how much more could be done on sanctions with Russia? You have done some proposals on that, but also could you comment on the Russian frozen assets? It almost seemed like General Kellogg in his presentation today morning was implicitly supportive of the European position to use the Russian frozen assets as leverage for Russia to adhere to a ceasefire and to say we will not take them now, but if you break a ceasefire, then we take them, which has been criticized by some economists, among others, Elena Rybakova, as too weak of a position. I would love to hear your views on that.
No, thanks for that. I think I would just frame what you asked about sanctions, what can be done there. We haven't used the full force of our sanctions abilities and enforcement abilities, as Ben just said, certainly in the Russian energy sector, but also in the broader financial sector. The Biden administration, on its way out, through executive order, did more of that. Why they waited until the very last minute, I don't know, but there's still room for more. I think the question, to my mind, is how we're going to enforce all this, and we're also at the same time, firing a lot of the people that work on that, because that's a whole machinery that has to be set up. I think Fiona and everyone else in this room knows that very, very well. So I don't see much of a direction in which this administration is preparing for that. In fact, they're preparing for the opposite. To Ben's point, it seems this is to provide sanctions relief to the Russians as part of this ongoing incentivizing with carrots strategy, if you want to call it that. But I think there's also kind of an interesting element that's emerged in the conversations here about this perception of weakness and strength, right? And it struck me that there's a similarity between how this administration is carrying out its current approach to Ukraine and how the Russians are carrying out their approach to us. Meaning that, to Fiona's point on how President Trump thinks about strength and weakness and respect, if you show weakness, what happens is they just keep pushing more. So I think now that Zelenskyy has come back to the table, which he has no other choice, he must come back to the table, as Pavlo also said. But what that is signaling is the U.S. is going to keep pushing more and more, because now he's seen in a weak position. And when you're in a weak position, that means you have plenty you can still push on, right? So it's actually going to increase the pressure, not decrease it, in my view. And the Russians are doing the exact same thing. With all of these incentives and carrots that we're giving them, will continue to give, they see a massive historic opportunity, in my view. They're thinking about geopolitics. They're thinking about restructuring and having a seat in the future of Europe's security order and beyond that, I think. And they are perceiving us as weak because we're giving things away, which to them signals we're going to keep pushing to see how far we can get. And they've obviously wanted regime change in Ukraine for a long time. And they have gotten us to talk about that now, right? This is their ultimate goal. They can get rid of Zelenskyy, put in someone that's going to de facto give them political control of Ukraine. So there's a strange similarity here, right? Except the Russians perceive us as weak right now, and we are perceiving Ukraine as weak, and both sides are pushing. And I think that's really, really troubling when you kind of recognize that. And we're talking about these geopolitical shifts, and I agree that Beijing sees this in geopolitical terms, the Russians see in geopolitical terms, and everything that Pavlo said about China's opportunities is really befuddling, because if there's only one thing that we know this administration has been very clear on, the president has been very clear on, is how much she sees China as the key problem for the United States. Yet everything we're doing right now in Ukraine, vis-a-vis our allies, vis-a-vis the economic wars that we're setting up, it is giving China a massive, historic opportunity to emerge as the major victor of this war. Having a foothold in Europe, I think that is something that will happen unless things shift. Really, we're setting ourselves up for another confrontation from a position of weakness, not a position of strength, vis-a-vis China. It's also moving the potential military confrontation over Taiwan closer and closer in time from the Chinese perspective, right? And so that's the thing we want to avoid, but everything we're doing is speeding up I think, Chinese decision-making on when they will have the opportunity to grab Taiwan. And that is really befuddling, and it signals to me again that certainly probably the president, maybe others in administration are not thinking about this in geopolitical interconnected terms, as we're talking about it here. They're seeing very separate issues that are in their minds, in some of their minds, certainly, are probably not connected to each other, which of course is not the reality that we live in, but that is the perception. And so the question is, how do we engage and how do we work with this White House, which I think we should, frankly, we should want the president to succeed. Any US president, we should want him to succeed. But there's a huge understanding gap here in the perception of the world and how certain actions have consequences that is just not coming together.
Mm-hmm. Can you also quickly say something about the frozen assets? Oh,
yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's good.
You know, on the frozen assets part, you know, that's been a befuddling situation in Europe, in my view. Europe really needs to get money fast, and we're seeing some of that happening in Germany and the EU level as well. Those assets are just sitting there. Take them, use them now. You need the money, Ukraine needs the money, it's right there. It's not gonna cost you anything. I think the concerns that are being raised about the implications of this and is it precedent setting, the concerns raised by some economists that you mentioned, can be addressed. The best paper that I've seen on this and work on this is by Philip Zelenskyy, who wrote a paper a couple of weeks ago on the Hoover website that really takes a deep look as to what the situation is right now, because it's changed in 3 years. The assets have been moved around and they're sitting as cash holdings, which also means they're not making any money. Like this 300 billion that can be invested and be earning interest rates, and it is not. So there's also all kinds of questions about the mismanagement of these funds, basically, that could be actually also making money, far more interest rates. But I don't understand, frankly, why there's so much opposition in some parts of Europe against the assets. That is low hanging fruit.
And it's a question if there really will be that leverage not to break a ceasefire. We have to come to an end, so I will give Fiona a quick 30 seconds last word here on the panel, because we have another great panel that is coming up in the end next. Okay, Pablo, 30 seconds for Fiona, 30 seconds for Pablo, and then we will conclude because we have another great session coming up in just 50 minutes.
I think there's an important point here because we're all members of the Council on Foreign Relations one way or another. So we tend to see the world from a foreign policy and a geopolitical perspective. And we heard from General Kellogg earlier this morning that that's not how President Putin, or rather President Trump, I always make that slip. I do all the time because, sometimes they see the world in the same ways, but very different ways, because Putin does see it geopolitically, but Trump sees it economically and from a trade perspective. He doesn't want a war with China over Taiwan. He'd give up Taiwan in a heartbeat for a bigger deal, a trade deal. And that's essentially what he was telling Zelenskyy, that he needed to get with the program. I mean, again, it was very clear from what General Kellogg said that Zelenskyy made a mistake because Trump sees the world in terms of everybody making some money and everybody getting something out of it. And if there'd been the deal signed on the minerals with the United States, with Trump and Zelenskyy, then everybody could have made something out of that. That's what he's trying to say. And he'll make a deal with Russia. There'll be all kinds of economic deals. He did that 1.0, the same kind of thing, looking for deals. And it's also what he's looking for with China. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to just orient ourselves in a different way and realizing that we're all probably not on the same page as where Trump is as well. And it explains, getting back to some of these questions, why there's a disconnect all the time. And he does see this as a big deal between Russia, the United States, and China. That is how he sees the world. Yeah. The big three sitting down and making deals.
Yeah, let me give just very quickly, Pablo, the opportunity to say very few last sentences, and then we will wrap this up. Pablo.
Yeah, one sentence about sanctions. Sanctions are actually quite good. The problem is their implementation. It's a set of lost opportunities. And now you can forget about any sort of real sanctions in the future towards someone else. You can play with tariffs, but playing with sanctions is over, no credibility. Mm-hmm. And what is happening with the assets, what Alina has just said, is a kind of joke for many countries, and I know it. And one sentence about our stakes now. So we are talking about why the Russian aggression against Ukraine had started and is happening. Putin is talking in his own way about the origins of the war. And if you just want to have a break, so fundamentally, in some moment, it would backfire, and it would backfire for everyone in the sense of lost or in translation, and would backfire also in the sense of total loss of credibility. And it's the fundamental point people should understand.
Thank you so much. Those were very good last words here. It's also a great lead over to the next session, which will discuss also Ukraine's economic needs, reconstruction, and so on. So have a coffee break. Thank you so much for our panelists for joining us today. We'll see you again.
Thanks, Philip.
Thank you. Great to see you. Slava Ukraini.
Thanks. Героям слава.